Hello and welcome to episode 12 of season 2 of Guido Talks. That's right, we're back for another week to talk through all the exciting goings on in Parliament and further afield. Everything that you've seen and some behind the scenes from the Guido Talks website. My name's Tom Harwood, and once again, I'm joined by Paul Staines, the founder and editor of Guido Talks, along with Christian Cowgie, a reporter here. So let's kick off right away with one of the biggest news items this week, and that is we are leaving lockdown next week, and we're going to be placed in a new tier system. That was all announced on Thursday. Now, how did that announcement go, Cowgie?
It went marvellously, apart from if you discount the fact the website broke entirely after 10 minutes. Many people still reporting outages. They may not know what tier their local area is going into. But thankfully, we were on hand to provide the full list. We were first with this information, giving people the full breakdowns, huge upgrading of severity across the country. There are now only 3 parts of the UK, only 700,000 English citizens under tier 1, which is already stricter than the original tier 1, and a massive shooting up of those in tier 2, and major city regions like Birmingham and Manchester going into tier 3, which is, in many ways indistinguishable from the full lockdown, especially in regards to hospitality. In fact, I'd actually observed that what has happened here with the transition from what is branded a full national lockdown to a tiered system is some of the most politically savvy strategy we've seen from the government, because Boris has been able to boast, yes, we are definitively leaving national lockdown on the 2nd of December, but for tens and tens of millions of people, really not that much of a difference in their day-to-day lives if they're going into tier 3.
Yeah, it hasn't really felt like we've been in a lockdown at all. I've been walking about a bit in London recently, which I gather I think is against the rules if it's not explicitly for exercise. But my God, if it's against the rules to leave your house not for exercise, then there are a lot of very dawdling exercises about in London. I mean, it's extraordinary walking around and seeing people just basically acting normally, big groups, walking around, making the most of all the shops that are open. And I was surprised at actually how many shops are open and serving people outside and that sort of stuff. It feels like we're sort of in a state of semi-lockdown, not total lockdown, and we'll be moving. Most of the country will be moving into a state of semi-lockdown again. It's not going to be that much of a change for millions of people.
It's been an odd one because, unlike the first lockdown, I've been completely, doing my duty for Queen and Country, sitting on my arse in front of Netflix every day. But I am very aware that many, many people are not, and some people are living their lives pretty normally, bar not being able to go to the pub. And so I'm certainly looking forward to a liberalisation there.
Although you say that, there is a pub near me that is very much open. It's just they're serving through a little hatch, and you can't buy a pint directly from them. You have to phone them up. You walk up to there, you have to ask them on the phone, and then they can hand you a delivered pint. And there's groups of people that stand outside there, not that differently to how we were before the lockdown. So, I mean, it's all a bit of a nonsense, really.
I saw one Twitter picture of a pub that says orders cannot be accepted less than 30 seconds beforehand. Text this number. So, I mean, there's a will to go.
Absolutely.
Stand outside, text your order, walk up to the counter. Brilliant.
Well, we're talking about all of this sort of state of lockdown and really not changing all that much. One of the most concerning stories this week is that we dug into the OBR analysis that Rishi Sunak based his statement on, his financial statement on, which was its central scenario of how the country's economy is going to be working over the next year is that not until June will we see these measures relaxed. We're going to be in a state of sort of medium to high alert level right the way through June. That's the OBR analysis. Now, we put that out as a story, and just after we did that, the Conservative Party met for a 1922 committee meeting, and that story was put by an enterprising backbench Tory MP to the Prime Minister, at which point he said that he was much more optimistic than the Office of Budget Responsibility. So suddenly, within the space of hours, we seem to have had a bit of a turnaround from the government in terms of their expectations of these restrictions. But it's a concerning thread, and one that we'll be definitely keeping an eye on over the next weeks and months. Because you would expect that this stuff will...
Very much related to that point is the optimism about the AstraZeneca drug is misplaced. The US is not going to approve it. And all this nonsense about, with half a dose, it's better than with a full dose, that doesn't sound credible to me. And in fact, people in the pharma world have told me off the record that of the 3 vaccines announced by the West, Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca is the weakest, and it's the one that Britain's ordered the most of. That's not to say it won't be effective enough for most of us, but it's definitely not the best drug according to the testing that's been done so far.
But of course, with the OBR, their excuse as to why their forecasts were so pessimistic in terms of those restrictions that we're going to be living under for the next 6 or 7 months, their excuse was that they did that before the Oxford vaccine was announced. So after the Pfizer and after the Moderna one had been announced. So it already seemed like we're getting this stream of vaccines. We're probably going to see more than these 3 anyway. And so we've got these all trickling through, and yet the OBR still decided that we'd somehow be in a state of lockdown or quasi-lockdown until June. But that was just one aspect of the spending review. So, Calgi, can you talk us through some of the other big headline-grabbing measures?
Yeah, of course. Well, we've talked about pessimistic civil service forecasts, and they were there in abundance in Rishi's spending review. We've now had it confirmed, almost entirely confirmed, that the projection is that we'll have seen an economic contracting of 11.3% this year, and the economy will be 3% permanently smaller in 2025. UK borrowing is now up to 394 billion quid this year, which is 4 times as much as the figure that shocked the country under Gordon Brown's premiership during the 2008-9 financial crash. And we're going to have 7.5% unemployment. So, things are rosy. And then we came on to the actual measures, and we were anticipating a big public sector wage freeze. And frankly, for a lot of Conservatives, what came was overly generous, because yes, there is going to be a public sector wage freeze, but that excludes doctors, nurses, and people working in the health sector. And it also excludes any public sector workers earning below the median wage of £24,000 a year. So the majority of public sector workers are going to get a pay rise. Of course, that's in spite of many of their private sector comrades going under the waterline. Departmental spending is going to rise by 3.8%. That's £14.8 billion. Of course, a massive amount also being allocated on defence spending. The health budget's up by 7 billion, and then essentially we got to the bit of austerity crumbs that Rishi threw to the Tory thinkers, and that was the reduction of foreign aid from 0.7% to 0.5%. And then we got a surprise rabbit out of the hat with this £4 billion levelling up fund for the red wall. So actually, what was set out in the spending review, if you just sat down and watched that without understanding the economic context, you wouldn't for one moment think that the economy has hit an iceberg and is going under at a terrifying rate. And it didn't please many Tory thinkers, sort of traditional backbenchers, those in the wonk world, did it?
I mean, what's about 4 billion that's been saved from foreign aid, and that's supposed to cover the hundreds of billions that the Chancellor just whimsically
the 400
spent?
billion deficit. Yeah.
If we've hit an iceberg, we're in the bar ordering trebles for everyone on the house. Because the spend...
It's got to be ordered with a substantial meal, though. That's the
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Well, actually, we should probably not talk so much about all the tiers. We've got a lot of stuff to get through. So, Calgie, can you tell us the big immediate political consequence of this foreign aid cut?
Yes, of course, we had a resignation. Not one of the exciting ones. Unfortunately, it was just the Baroness, but it was a resignation of Baroness Sugg from the FCDO, who's a proper sort of die-in-the-wool Cameroon, and was fighting for 0.7%. She'd been on resignation watch from earlier that morning, and about an hour after submitting the letter, she was out. But I wouldn't anticipate that the Tory folds in the Commons will be too much of an issue away from the usual lot. But I think the Lords is going to be pretty tricky on this, especially given how many of the sort of the Cameroon era, grandees have been moved up into the Lords, and they're all there waiting and ready to ping pong this back for a few months.
And of course, the Tories don't have a majority in the Lords anyway. There's a lot of there's a super majority of Remainers, whether they're Lib Dem, crossbench, or Labour, and there tends to be quite a lot of crossover between that sort of worldview and the pro-massive foreign aid.
Christian, far be from me to question a graduate of Lord North's constitutional law. How can the Lords block a finance bill?
Well, is it a finance? I mean, there are two contrasting things here, because on the one hand, it could be argued to be a finance bill. On the other hand, of course, it is a direct U-turn on a manifesto pledge. So there's no hope at all of the government using the Salisbury Convention to get it through.
Arguably, and I've argued this with a few people, including journalists, they're not abandoning their stated intention, whether you believe it or not, doesn't matter, is to temporarily pause it, not to abandon the target. So I think it's just, they could argue, whether you believe them or not, that it's just a financial statement. Anyway, query that.
Well. We will keep an eye on that as it goes forward. One of the other things that was a bit contentious in this budget is that while just under half of the public sector saw their pay frozen, there was nothing explicitly in the spending statement about MP pay. And this was an issue that was building quite a lot off the back of our campaign over the course of this week, so much so that the Prime Minister himself addressed it on, I believe, Tuesday. And then several members of Parliament stood up to ask both the Prime Minister in PMQs and then Rishi Sunak in the questions following his statement about the issue of MP pay. And they all seemed pretty opposed to the idea, but none of them would commit to legislating about it. It was all about trying to persuade the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority to not grant a pay rise. And this is what Rishi Sunak said in his response to Sir Peter Bottomley.
And his last point, Mr. Speaker, I can tell him that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has written on behalf of the government to IPSA in advance of the statement, just to inform them of the government's approach to public sector pay and ask them to take that into consideration when they decide what they would like to do. Obviously, they are an independent body.
So Michael Gove wrote to IPSA to ask to not be given a pay rise, but this is making MPs look much more feeble than they actually are. Parliament is sovereign. If they genuinely didn't want a pay rise and wanted to guarantee that they wouldn't get one rather than just asking IPSA nicely, Rishi Sunak could have said, and we will legislate to stop MPs getting a pay rise. It's totally within their power to. And yet they seem to rather like the idea that it's out of their control, that if they're going to be given lots more money, that's totally up to an independent body. This was building, though, throughout the week. And Calgi, can you tell us a bit about the MPs who started coming out and saying that they'd disavow one if it was given?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're now up to between 60 and 70 Tory MPs, certainly the upper end echelons of that, who have explicitly said they don't want the pay rise. We'd collected, I think, about a dozen. We'd had MPs writing to us disavowing the move, and then we saw a letter from Tory new intaker Deanna Davison halfway through the week, and that got, I think, over 60 additional signatures. So there is a huge movement here, but the problem is that a lot of MPs seem to think that there's a binary option between having IPSA and abolishing IPSA. And I don't think any one of us wants MPs to go back to the old, expenses system. But there's an obvious point to be made, which is there should be a way for MPs to formally reject a pay rise from entering their bank account. Because at the moment, they've only got two options. They can either bow and scrape before the unelected head of IPSA and ask him to not do one across the board, or they receive the pay rise and have to privately pledge to give it to charity, which obviously is voluntary, it's unaccountable. They might do it 1 year and then take it the next years. So there needs to be reform, and it's a massive oversight. And hopefully something can be built from this spread of feeling within the House of Commons this year to see a reform going forward.
Although obviously Number 10 are not very keen to put forward legislation, because there are a lot of backbenchers who quite quietly do want a bit more money, very obviously, no matter what they might say in public. But this brings us on to the whole question of parliamentary standards or standards in public life and ministerial standards. And Paul, there was a story to do with that earlier in the week as well. Can you talk us through that?
Yes, their PM's advisor on ethics, Sir Alex Allen, resigned after the PM said, "Thank you very much for your report," saying, "Pretty Patel was guilty of bullying. I don't agree. I'm the Prime Minister. I have the final decision. So no thanks." So Alex Allen resigns, and there was quite a hoo-ha about it. The press is up in arms, and Pretty Patel, who has, let's be fair, a lot of enemies across politics, was under fire. And I think that if people knew that Sir Alex Allen wasn't quite the straight facts that people are making out, they might take a different view about this. Pretty Patel is guilty of being forceful, shouting and swearing at underlings. What kind of boss would do that, eh, boys? I mean, this is just absolute snowflakery. Now, I know you have to be careful in human resources nowadays, but it was over the top, and I think the Prime Minister was right to refuse it. And Alex Allen, we've been digging into, and we'll have some more to say about it.
Well, we'll keep our eyes peeled for that. There was, of course, more staffing changes in Number 10. One of the bigger stories that happened on Thursday was a new Number 10 Chief of Staff came in unexpectedly for some early, just a mere week or so after Eddie Lister was appointed as an interim Chief of Staff. Calgi, can you talk us through that?
Yeah, of course, readers and watchers won't have missed the thing that exploded a couple of weeks ago when obviously Lee Kane and Dominic Cummings walked out, and actually it all focused around this quite obscure appointment to a chief of staff who it's very much hoped will, from an organisational point of view, get the Number 10 train back on the tracks and focused on delivering those manifesto commitments and provide a bit of focus to the programme. Of course, readers will be unaware that unfortunately on Thursday we became aware that the appointment was about to be made. We were writing up the story as it happened. In fact, I think we were given a few anonymous descriptors. We knew it was going to be a man, we knew it was going to be a former civil servant, and we were told that it's someone outside of the box, but not in a conventional sense. And actually, I don't think anyone would have guessed, because in the end, we got a guy called Dan Rosenfield, who is a former PPS to Alistair Darling and George Osborne, and a former banker also, and a Jewish activist, anti-racism activist, and I think he probably ticks a lot of boxes. But for those of you who liked the chaos and the the laughs and the rows of the Cummings administration, it's going to be a bit more head down, bureaucratic, solemn from now on. This is really a very straight bat, boring pick to sort of balance out perhaps some of the more eccentric elements of Boris's management style. You sort of do need that yin and yang, I suppose. You've got back in City Hall, you had Sir Eddie Lister, who was sort of the sort of straight-faced side to the Boris administration, while Boris would do the big picture sort of stuff. He'd be there with the detail, and I think this will probably reflect that. Now, I think, Calgi, you tweeted an anecdote about our new incoming Downing Street Chief of Staff somehow doing an all-nighter and being more engaged in his work in the morning or something. What was that? There was naturally went through the Google archives about this guy once it had been announced, and one of the best anecdotes I found was that he got back one night at about 2 o'clock in the morning after a very long day at work, and it was his little boy's birthday the next day, and he bought him a trampoline that needed assembling, and he was determined to get it done so it was there ready for his boy to wake up the next day. And it took him, I think, about an hour and a half. He finished at 4:45. He was at his desk back in the Treasury at 6:30. And he claimed that the activity of doing this was actually made him more alert for a day's work than he would otherwise have been. Now, I don't believe that, but he is certainly very dedicated. I was personally very fascinated to find out that he was the guy who had to interrupt a meeting in 2009 with Alistair Darling and tap him on the shoulder and inform him that the CEO of RBS needed to talk because the shares had dropped by 40%. And that was, I think, essentially the moment that Alistair Darling knew that he needed to do a bank bailout. So this guy has a pretty incredible role in British political history for the last decade and a bit, but very much a backroom guy. Well, moving from the intricacies of Downing Street up to Scotland, what's going on north of the border this week, Paul?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon has achieved what many SNP extremists have always hoped and wished for. She has banned the English from coming to Scotland. To be fair to her, for health protection reasons, she is banning movement between local authority areas, which obviously means and includes the internal border between Scotland and England, as well as Northern Ireland. So much tighter, but also plays into certain Scottish hopes on the part of her more extreme flank. That all comes to an end when the lockdown ends just before Christmas, because all the four nations got around the table and for once agreed to have the same rules, which will allow people from Wales and Scotland who are living in England to go home, and vice versa. So at least we have one Christmas bit of concord between the home nations.
5 days.
We get Boris and
of...
Nicola to have a football match over the border, and then go back after.
And then go back to
The
war.
way Scotland's
Blimey.
team are doing at the moment, I don't think she's going to want to do that.
Although it was peculiar, because you do get the sense, as you were saying, Paul, that this is something that the SNP and a lot of their activists have wanted for a long, long time. They were almost sort of gleefully pointing out examples. I think it was Ian Blackford or Angus Robertson, one of them.
It was Blackford
On Twitter.
Yeah.
It was Ian Blackford
it was
on
Blackford.
Twitter. He quote tweeted some random photographer who'd gone up to photograph the Northern Lights in Scotland, quote tweeting saying, "What are you doing in Scotland? You shouldn't be here. You're English." And it's the venom by which these SNP politicians are sort of shouting at people who aren't Scottish is quite extraordinary. And if they were doing it to any other... Yeah, go on.
Yeah, and then it turned out that photographer had actually moved to Scotland a couple of weeks ago. So he was perfectly entitled to be doing what he was doing. So it looks like Ian Blackford had failed his audition for the McStasi, or whatever they're trying to go do up there.
It's just sectarianism. It's just xenophobia. Just because someone happens to be born in England doesn't mean that they're not necessarily living in Scotland or whatever. Could you imagine if he did that to any other ethnic minority, any other group of people? Like, I mean, it would obviously be called out for the racism that it is.
Do you remember when the first lockdown started, there was a whole load of SNP activists on the border with signs saying, "Go home, English, you're not welcome," or something to that effect?
Well, speaking of nutters shouting aimlessly at people crossing a border, to another group of nutters who shout aimlessly at people on Twitter. What was going on with Carol Cadwallader this week, Paul?
Well, it was an exclusive on Thursday morning. I got the briefing on Wednesday night from sources not a million miles away from Aaron Banks that Carol Cadwallader was giving in on her long-running libel case. Now, we've been covering this for a month since the judge in the case said he'd had enough of all her prevarication and procrastination and her attempts to avoid a day of judgment, and gave her 28 days a month to come up with some evidence that Aaron Banks was backed by the Russians and financed, and there was some financial involvement in the anti-Europe campaign. We were pretty confident that wasn't true. The reason we were pretty confident that wasn't true was because the National Crime Agency, a body with the power to arrest, interview, get warrants, track bank accounts, and call on the assistance of foreign police forces, found that Aaron Banks had not taken a single penny from Russia. So since that point, I've been pretty confident that Banks is telling the truth. He tells me that he offered Carol Cadwallader a way out after the NCA ruling or finding that there was no further action required and he was innocent, and she didn't take it. So she has pushed it all the way until today, when she was due to be in court at 10:30. Late last night, her lawyers changed their defence and they withdrew. And the phrase was they amended the defence of truth. They withdrew the defence of truth, which effectively means, in the most generous interpretation, that she had no evidence. And some of us say that when you admit that you haven't told the truth, what does that mean? You're lying. Now, she hasn't completely withdrawn her action. The judge gave her till January to make a case that she has a public interest defence. She is claiming that despite it not being true, despite she saying she had evidence and then turning out she doesn't have evidence, she was acting in the public interest. Now, I'm pretty sure that she's campaigned against disinformation. Since she's been telling lies about Aaron Banks, that appears to me to be disinformation of her own, and there is no public interest defence for that. So I'll be very surprised if this works. Anyway, the judge demanded that she put £62,000 as a down payment down. My understanding is that Aaron Banks' costs are in the region of £250,000 so far. Her costs will no doubt be similar. If she loses, she's going to have to pay the lot, I imagine. She's had all the chances she could have to withdraw it. Even today on Twitter, she was denying that she changed her from spending years accusing Aaron Banks of being backed by the Russians. She denied to Nigel Farage, who was taunting her, that she'd even said that. Yet the judge in a previous hearing ruled that's exactly what she said. So, God knows what's going on. I think she's having a moment. Anyway, it's
Having a very moment.
She's been having a moment since 2016, by the sounds of things. But
well, she's raised £500,000. She's raised nearly £175,000 for the Aaron Banks case. She's raised £300,000 for her investigative journalism. Her investigative journalism is bollocks. This absolute farce of accusing everyone of being in the pay of the Russians has resulted in her losing this case. It's untrue, and she should lose that Orwell Prize, because of the 3 stories that she was cited as deserving to win the Orwell Prize award, 3 of them reference the Russia funding issue, which we now know she had no evidence for.
It's quite extraordinary how these sort of great, grandiose awarding bodies were so whipped up into this mindset of Romaniac sentiment that literal brazen lies can be awarded with high journalistic honour because they reinforce the prejudices of the awarding body. It really speaks to a deep, deep problem that the establishment has, really, when it comes to dealing with and accepting election or referendum results that they don't like. Speaking of accepting those results, go on.
Matthew Goodwin, the academic, describes it as the Brexit referendum result inspired a need for magical thinking on the part of Remainers. They could not believe that a majority of the people in this country would back Brexit. So they blamed it on everyone's racist. When that didn't work, they blamed it on Facebook and dirty tricks with digital advertising. And failing that, the Russians did it. It's all magical thinking.
Amazing. It is amazing how when Barack Obama pioneers micro-targeting in 2008, that's an amazing, brilliant act of new politics from a centrist, centre-left presidential candidate. But then when someone on the right does exactly the same thing, now it's suddenly dark and nefarious and potentially evil. I mean, give me a break. It is absolute nonsense. But thankfully, all of that is past us because Brexit happened in January. And do you know what? We're leaving the transition period at the end of this year too. And one of the more positive stories this week that we ran with regards to that on Guido is that it looks like the Labour Party have finally found a position. After years of spinning around and trying to prevent the implementation of that democratic referendum, after years of setting up, I think it was 6 tests that Keir Starmer came up with that were designed to fail so that they could keep voting against implementing Brexit, now they seem to have reconciled with potentially voting for a future trade agreement if one is agreed this year between the UK and the EU. And this would be a big step for them, finally internalising the fact that the UK has left the EU and will be leaving its regulatory orbit as well. So if a deal is agreed, and I think we basically think it's more likely than not that a deal will be agreed. Not impossible that one won't, but more likely than not one will. It will be very satisfying to see the people who stirred up the big anti-Brexit movement, anti-democratic movement last year, hang their heads in shame and traipse through the voting lobbies alongside the Brexiteer right. That would be a great, great sight. And it looks like that's what Labour's going to do.
Not with great joy, though. They're doing it because they need to get closer to the views of their voters or their former voters. But they're not doing it out of principle.
Well, it's also entirely pragmatic, because if they were to vote against whatever deal is agreed in Brussels and Boris brings back, they wouldn't be voting against Brexit. They'd be voting for a no-deal Brexit or no future relationship. But it just reminds me of when Labour MEPs did just that, and they revelled in voting against the deal in the European Parliament. The MEPs voted against the deal. They thought they were rejecting Brexit, but actually Labour MEPs at the time were the only people voting for no deal. And it's great that there's now some great tactical turnaround to realise that that's not a strategy that garners an outcome they want.
Well, it is, of course. It's finally they're using the same logic that Theresa May tried to appeal to in the dying days of her administration. She famously stood at a dispatch box and shouted at the Labour Party that, if you want to stop a no-deal Brexit, the only way to stop a no-deal Brexit is to vote for a deal. And yet the Labour Party and Keir Starmer had in their minds this sort of unicorn of just disregarding the largest electoral mandate in the history of this country and thinking they could just wish it away. Well, that worked out well for them in the general election.
It worked out well for Theresa as well, because as we revealed this week, she is of the firm belief that female leaders have a historic record of achieving the outcomes they want in comparison to male leaders. But we left that for the comment section to argue out.
Right. Well, leaving aside the turmoil in the Tory party and anguish over former leaders, there's some anguish over a former leader of the Labour Party going on, and certainly some idolisers of Jeremy Corbyn on the Labour NEC have been very, very angry this week. What was going on, Calgie?
Well, the Labour NEC met to elect a new chair. And there had been some scuffles in the day before, because there was talk that there was going to try and be a blocking of the Fire Brigades Union candidate, who was the natural successor, apparently, is all internal Labour politics. Anyway, Ian Murray got blocked. The Corbynista candidate got blocked, and instead Margaret Beckett is now the new chair of Labour's NEC. And the Corbynistas, as we've seen repeatedly, don't handle losing elections well. So what they decided to do was a walkout, which in the era of Zoom means closing their laptops. And 13 of the hard left walked out of the Zoom meeting, cheer-led, we understood, by fan favourite Laura Pidcock, who, as a tactician for winning elections, is unbridled. And again, the Labour row marches on and marches out of the Zoom meeting.
I don't understand the tactics of this. All that they achieved was they made it easier for the meeting to go on. And from Margaret, by all accounts, it was a much more harmonious and productive meeting than normal, because they didn't have a load of the far left bickering about minor details. The tactics of this, I don't understand. The strategic genius of this is non-existent. It's like when students go on a lecture strike. The only people who care, well, nobody cares. The lecturers think, oh, I've got the afternoon off, and the students miss out on their education. It's the same with them. The left lost the opportunity to make any case whatsoever. So great strategy and tactics by Laura Pidcock and co. Well done.
Amazing. I love the idea of Laura Pidcock just staring down the Labour centrists saying, I'll do it, I'll stop voting.
I will press this.
Brilliant. Go on, knock yourself out, Laura. Well, it wasn't all sunshine for the Labour Party right this week, or the centrists within the Labour Party this week, because a row was brewing in the Cabinet Office. And a normally very, very polite man, Michael Gove, has been really quite admonishing of his opposite number, Rachel Reeves, in a letter that he sent this week that we got our hands on before it was made public, which really put to bed some of the questionable claims that the Labour Party have been making about all this outsourcing and particularly the use of a company called Serco. For weeks and weeks, the Labour Party, and particularly Rachel Reeves, had been saying sack Serco and stop using these sort of outsourced things. Anyway, it turns out that just about every Labour council in the country uses Serco, not least of all the Labour council in Rachel Reeves' own constituency. And she hasn't been telling them to sack Serco. Similarly, there was criticism that Sir Keir Starmer raised at Prime Minister's Questions last week, where he said he said that you're not using the normal process to tender to procure items like PPE. Now, that's because the normal process to tender to secure items like PPE takes 28 days to run in the quickest possible sense. So really what Sir Keir was saying was, why didn't you take longer to get PPE? Whereas just a few weeks before, he was saying you need to get PPE as quickly as you possibly can. Now, these Labour arguments are so clearly opportunistic and not evenly applied, especially when you look at the Labour administrations, whether they're in councils or in Wales, where the Labour Party seems to do just about everything that the Labour Party in Westminster criticises. It was...
I'm going to cast your mind back, because if you remember that period at the start where we were desperate for PPE. I was speaking to a Downing Street advisor, or someone who was working Downing Street at the time, who said every 9:15 meeting every day was about how can we get PPE, where are we going to get PPE, and it wasn't about how much it's going to cost or any details of that. It was get it as fast as possible at all costs. You know, they were terrified that the nurses were going to run out of. You know, it would just been a total disaster. So all this Captain Hindsight action from him. So why did he go through normal procedure? I'll tell you someone else who's our old friend Jolyon Moore is, you know, raising crowdfunding for his campaign to go look into all these procedures. I mean, Jolyon Moore is the last person you'd want overseeing a procurement process. So I think they'll get nowhere. It was within the law to suspend procurement rules, because you're allowed to in an emergency. And if a pandemic isn't an emergency, what is?
Well, it is worth looking at this letter if you have a spare moment, because it is Michael Gove, as I say, is a normally very, very polite man, and he does start off this letter in a very polite way, but it is completely admonishing of what the Labour Party does in a very skillful way. But someone else who got, perhaps more outwardly angry this week was the Tory backbencher Charles Walker, one of the staunchest opponents of coronavirus authoritarian measures. Why did he get into such a rage this week, Calgie?
Well, I'm pretty sure Charles Walker has been, set to 100% anger for about 2 months now. I mean, I've never seen a clip. of him in the last month where he's not shouting at the government, but it was a very good performance. And the long and short of what happened is that a elderly female anti-lockdown protester outside or between Parliament and Portcullis House was arrested and dragged to the police van. I think it was described spread eagle, and he was, shouting, "What an outrage! What a disgrace!" And he told an onlooker that he was going to raise it in Parliament, and true to his word, 5 minutes later was in Parliament raising the very issue and saying Boris and Priti Patel need to come to the House straight away to sort it out.
Absolutely. Let's have a listen to that now.
You don't need to obey the orders of police officers. You must have others. What an outrage. What a disgrace. You're talking along without doing nothing. That's what's going on at the moment. This is an absolute disgrace. What's going on? What's going on?
Point of order, Sir Charles Walker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have just witnessed an elderly lady peacefully protesting with a handful of other people be arrested and carried spread eagle to a police van just outside the precinct of the House of Commons. This is a disgrace. This is un-British. It is unconstitutional. And this government, our Prime Minister, needs to end these injustices now. Madam Deputy Speaker, will you bring the Prime Minister and or the Home Secretary here today to sort this out? She was an old lady robbed of her dignity for having the courage to protest about having her fundamental rights and those of my constituents and others removed.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. I can see that this is obviously an extremely distressing situation. I shall, of course, ensure that the Speaker is aware of the honourable gentleman's comments, but I also know that we have ministers here who I'm sure will ensure that his comments are fed back and his very strong views on the incident that happened. Thank you.
But, of course, Boris and Priti never did come to the chamber, so another time, hopefully, Sir Charles.
Maybe it's something that they could bring up in the new, soon-to-be-happening lobby briefings that will be on television. Paul, could you talk us through what we found out about these long-trailed lobby briefings this week?
Long-trailed and long campaigned for. Looking back in the archive, I think it's 10 years I've been campaigning to get lobby briefings, or the briefings rather, televised. And they will be from January the 11th next year, when Allegra Stratton, who used to be on the telly, on Newsnight and on Peston, so you'll probably recognise her, will be delivering the first lobby briefings. They are going to be in the refurbed Downing Street number 9, I think, which is a former Privy Council courtroom. So it should be the right place to make judgments. But I think it's going to be refurbed, modernised. I'm very intrigued to see how they are going to make it COVID secure. There are a couple of hundred lobby hacks. I think it would have to be a pretty big room and well divided to fit them all in. So I don't know how the queuing system's going to work, or whether there's going to be a two-tier system for journalists. I presume the broadcasters will be given priority, they usually are, but how the rest of the lobby are treated, allowed in, will be intriguing. I'd be applying for a pass so I can regularly attend and make my presence known. I'm looking forward to it.
You heard it here first. What a way to end the podcast. Well, from the 11th of January, there'll be these televised briefings 3 days a week, and hopefully Paul will be sitting there when you'll be able to see the manifestation of Guido Fawkes on television, as well as Paul puts the government to the test.
It's either me or Christian.
Stock up on popcorn.
Well, thank you so much for sticking with us for another episode of Guido Talks. Remember, if you are watching this on YouTube, to hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell to get this right in your notification panel every Friday. If you're listening to us where you normally get your podcasts from, check us out on YouTube as well. Thank you once again for sticking with us, and we'll see you next week. Bye.